Well, this episode's gonna be a little bit steamy, PG-13-y. If you're a Christian chasing after Jesus and you've ever wondered why is sex such a hard issue to tackle, then do me a favor, go ahead and put the kids on the Kids Bible app and join me for the next few minutes because we're gonna be talking about the most common mistakes Christians make about sex today on Church Door. Hey there, it's Ian once again. Thank you so much for taking a little bit of your time to join us today for Church Door, where we believe that what we have here for you today is going to take you farther in your journey with Jesus than you've ever been before. And we know there's other people in your life that need a little bit of encouragement just like you do today. So go ahead and share this video with somebody. Use your social media. You know how to do it. Go ahead and send it out to some friends and ask them to join you today. And as you share, know that we are here to give you prayer if you need some. So you'll see a number popping up underneath me. You can text prayer to that number, or you can reach out to our team, which is here live every single week at 11:30 Central Standard Time. We're in the chat, so go ahead and hit us up. We're so glad that you've joined us today. Before we jump into today's subject, I do want to say what we're talking about today will not be explicit, but it will be sensitive. So I do want to encourage you, if you have kids in the room, just be cognitive of what we're talking about today is a little bit of a sensitive subject. So right after I got out of high school, I got a little letter in the mail from a company called Cutco. They were offering jobs to people who were fresh out of high school, getting ready to go into college, that would make a little bit more money than usual for people of our age. This company you have maybe heard of, maybe you've even had an in-home presentation from them before, but what they do is they sell really high-end knives. And your job as a Cutco salesperson is to take those knives into people's houses and help them see how important it is for them to have that tool and how well they can use it in their home. They taught us how important it was to have the right tools for the right job in the kitchen. And of course, I was bought in because my dad always said that you gotta have the right tool for the right job. For example, you don't cut an onion with a paring knife. You use a larger chef's knife because it actually goes a lot faster. But not only do you have to have the right tool for the right job, you also have to learn how to use the tool rightly. I was always impressed when I would watch chefs on the Food Network and seeing them chop up things really fast. One of the cool perks that I learned as I became a knife salesman was how to properly use a knife. Actually, check this out. What I learned about using a knife was two things. One, you always keep the knife on the cutting board. But also, so you don't cut your fingers off, you actually have to put your fingers on the blade of the knife. And as you cut into whatever you're cutting to, you always keep contact to the knife. It's really an intimate kind of process. Your hands and your knife have to be connected at all times. As you could see in this example, if I was not careful with that knife and I didn't stay intimately acquainted with its use, it could be harmful towards me. I could cut a finger off. But not only that, if I decided to use that knife in the wrong fashion, it ultimately could be catastrophic. I could really hurt somebody with this, maybe even kill them. See, a knife used in the right context is a great thing. It's a fantastic tool, but used wrong could be super dangerous for us. I think we see parallels in this within sexuality and our sex life. If sex is taken out of context, if it's used incorrectly, it can be a very dangerous thing. But in the right context, given the right point of view and the right intimacy with sex, it can be a beautiful and wonderful thing. And in knowing how powerful sex is within our lives, we must admit that sex is significant. And if sex is significant in our lives, if it's such a powerful thing, then rightfully we must be responsible for how it is used and wielded in our life. Colossians 1:16 says this. It says, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him." So if this scripture rings true, it means that sex and sexuality all flow through Jesus Christ himself and are for him. And I know that sounds kind of weird, right? When we see sex in a modern context, it's hard to put it through the lens of spirituality. What these scriptures are ultimately telling us is that the aim and result of our sex is something good when it goes to honor Jesus in its practice. It is our culture, it is the way we think about sex in our context that ultimately distorts the true reality and aim for sex. To some, the modern distortions and the modern standpoints on sexuality are no big deal. These distortions are not something to be dealt with, but ultimately it is something that we must grapple with, because when sex ultimately distorted, it leads to all kinds of things that are unfortunate in our world. We can look and see that over 4.1 million people today are being traded and sold for sex for their bodies. And over 1 million of those are children. 71% of all sex trade is around women and children alone. This industry itself generates $99 billion worth of money every single year. And you might be thinking, what does this have to do with me? Like, I'm not involved with sex trade. I mean, what I do between me and my partner in my bed, that's just between me and them. It's an intimate thing. Yet for the Christ follower, all things are through him and for him. So we do have to ask ourselves, how is our outlook on sex creating a Christ-centered outlook? Because if the outlook on sex that we have is all about me and my personal pleasure, then ultimately we turn sex into a commodity. Something that could be given, taken, sold, traded, wielded, or even used. And when we wield a me-centric view of sexuality, this spills out into our families. It spills out into our communities, and where we may not be directly involved with the distortion, ultimately the echoes of our own actions lead to the distortions. That is why today we want to dig in and ask ourselves the question, what are the most common mistakes that Christians make about sex? And it really lays within a dichotomy framework. There's two major mistakes that we make in our view of sex. And the first one of that is a laxed understanding of sex. The other side would be a legalistic side of sex. But on either one of these extremes, there is in health that lead to sex becoming a commodity. Now, the good news is that we're not the only Christians in history to ever have to struggle with this subject. Paul points out in 1 Corinthians 4-6 this struggle that existed in the new church of Corinth. And he begins to address this issue directly. And anyone who has been following Christ for any amount of time realizes that there are a lot of issues, a lot of things that we have to struggle through, but where we get our information is of the highest importance. In chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, Paul says that the Corinthians have countless guides, but not enough fathers. So in other words, there's a lot of information, but not enough wisdom. There's a lot of things out there about sex, but the wisdom that it takes to have the right using and the right wielding of this gift that God has given us is of highest importance. And even though the subject might be hard to broach, maybe being like dad sitting you down and having the birds and the bees talk, it is important to take in the wisdom of those who have followed Jesus before us. and ask ourselves, how is God in the center of it? The church in Corinth, not unlike us, also struggled with taking cues of sex from the culture, but also being hyper legalistic about the religious views that they might have had around this topic. In chapter 5, which is where we're going to dive in first, we see this first laxed ideal of sexuality. If you'll dig in with me here at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. Again, this is the lax standard of the culture around them. And sexual immorality is something that we must take note of, because where do we get morality? Do we get it from within ourselves? Do we learn what's moral within our own standard? No, we can't do that, because everybody's standard is different. So who gives us the moral standard for sexuality? Well, that's God Himself. He bakes this within His message. And of a kind that is not tolerated even among the pagans. So He's saying that even though they've taken cues from the culture, their sexual practice has even gotten uncomfortable to the people around. Let's see what kind of practice it's become. For a man has had his father's wife, or in other words, this was a son sleeping with his mother. And you are arrogant. This is what Paul says. And he's like, and you're kind of bragging about this. If you go down into verse 6 of this chapter, he says, you're bragging about this immorality. What's wrong? Because even having a little bit of this will spoil the whole community. Ultimately, what Paul is saying, just a little bit of distortion from the outside can really change and manipulate and distort what is on the inside. So we have to be careful not to allow the cues of our culture to change our practice as followers of Jesus. During Passover, when they would eat unleavened bread, which the leaven in bread represented sin, so during this time they would take that out of the bread. They would clean their whole homes, cleaning out the cabinets, sweeping in every corner to make sure every piece of yeast was completely eradicated. But not only that, after they were done doing that cleaning, they would go out and they would pray and they would denounce any yeast that was left in the entire home. This means we take God's view seriously in everything that He tells us, whether that's about our life or the practices within our lives. We care most about His view than our own view or even the culture's view. John tells us in 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 16, he says this, he says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If any of you love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world." This word desire can also be translated lusts. So you might say the lust of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life. These are the things from the world. This is the type of leaven that the world operates on. We lust after bodies. We lust after things that we want. And it's all ultimately for our own gain, not the gain of the kingdom. On the other hand, it is just as dangerous to believe that somehow that through our own power we can overcome lust, that somehow we can beat it out of ourselves. That's why the second most common mistake we make as Christians with sex is a legalistic understanding of sex. We see this kind of point of view exemplified in modern purity culture. Actually, we're not going to hit it today, but in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, Paul kind of admonishes people for being overly legalistic about their practice that was basically saying, just don't have sex. When sex is a very real part of who God has made us to be, and in its right context is good and should be celebrated. But if somehow we have decided that if I could just stay pure, then God will give me this. He'll give me a good life. He'll give me good marriage. He'll give me pleasure. We have been strongly misguided. In recent years, the author Joshua Harris, who was the poster child for the purity movement, he wrote a book called I Kiss Dating Goodbye, has recently left his wife and went through a journey that he calls deconstructing his faith. And the frailness lies within the fact that if we think we can tame a beast, then we're ultimately going to be eaten by the beast. Yet again, this is another me-centric version of sexuality. One that says, if I just wield sex in the right way, I will get what I need or what I want. So if sexuality isn't a laxed view, or if it's not a legalistic view, what is our view of sex as Christians? Ultimately, I believe this. Our view as Christians is that sex is a proclamation, not display. Don't get me wrong. We're not saying display your sex. We're saying that from our sex, there's a proclamation that comes. And what is that proclamation? Is that God is good and He would be glorified in and through it. It's not my sex. It's not my control. It's ultimately for the glory of God. And Paul reiterates this in chapter 6, verses 18 through 20. Would you read with me? Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin as a person commits is outside the body. And that word body, which is the Greek soma, isn't just the physical body. It's meaning our entirety, our whole self, our mind, body, and soul. So when we commit sexual immorality, we sin against our whole being. It's all tied together. But the sexual immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. Again, remember the position of both of these other views of sexuality. It's me-centric. But he reminds us again in our sexuality, in the way he has made us to be, is that we are not our own. Whose are we? For we were bought for a price so that we could glorify God in our whole existence, our mind, our body, and our soul. So glorifying God is a proclamation. And we see echoes of this proclamation from our relationship with Jesus that reflect into our sexual relationships. The first part of that is commitment. Just as much as we are committed or we're in covenant with Jesus, when we enter a sexual relationship, it should only be in the context of covenant or marriage. The Bible tells us that a man and a woman leave their parents and become one flesh. That word for one flesh is actually meaning glue, like a binding that cannot be pulled apart. The second part that is reflected in our relationship with Jesus, that is also within the sex relationship, is fidelity. In this picture is that we never leave each other, is that we've committed ourselves to that relationship long term. And finally, we also see a picture of life being given. Obviously, in the sexual relationship, there is a reproduction of life or a celebration of life, as much as in our walk with Jesus, when we follow Him, life comes out of that relationship. So sexuality that is rightfully pointed towards God produces these things. And as a byproduct, we have joy, we have peace, and we have the blessings of God that reflect out of us. So here's my action step for you here today. Have the talk. Have the sex talk within your own heart with your partner and ask the question, are we reflecting Jesus ultimately through our relationship sexually? If you're watching today and you are one of those people who have been struggling in this area, I want to encourage you that you can abandon yourself and turn everything, including your sexual practices, towards God, and He will renew you. no matter where you're at today, we want to walk with you through the struggles that you might have. If somehow this message has been helpful to you today, we want to encourage you to go ahead and go to rivervalleyrockford.org/give and join us on our mission to help other people just like you take their next step with Jesus. We are so glad that you've come to join us today, and we cannot wait for you to join us again next week. Have a blessed week.